The sound was the first thing to fade, the sharp, final crack of the rifle shot dissolving into a ringing silence. A single, spent brass cartridge, still warm, teetered on a jagged piece of Syrian rock before rolling to a stop. Down in the valley, the relentless hammering of enemy machine guns had ceased. The only voice was a whisper of static, then a grizzled, awe-filled tone breaking through the quiet. "Ghost, is that you?" The entire ridge is silent. "What in God's name did you just do?" 1 week earlier, the air in the Joint Operations Center in Qatar was thick with tension and the low hum of servers. Digital maps glowed on massive screens, displaying a topographical nightmare in the Al-Tanf region known unofficially as the Devil's Bowl. Colonel James Mitchell, his face etched with the strain of command, pointed a laser at the screen. "Valkyrie is here," he said, hovering on a small, rocky outcrop. "They're pinned. Their exfil bird was driven off by RPG fire. They have casualties." A live drone feed, ghostly green from thermal imaging, showed the heat signatures of the SEAL team, a small cluster of life surrounded by dozens of hotter, moving dots closing in. The voice that crackled over the speaker was strained, a man fighting to keep his professional calm. "JOC, this is Valkyrie actual. Negative on the sniper solution. Repeat, the angles are impossible. They have us in a perfect kill zone from those eastern caves." It was the team's lead sniper, a man whose skill was legend. If he said it was impossible, it was. Quietly seated at a terminal slightly apart from the Army and Navy personnel was Technical Sergeant Caitlin Reyes. Her Air Force blues seemed out of place in the room, full of combat fatigues. While others focused on the trap team, her eyes were locked on the terrain itself. She zoomed in on the eastern ridge, then the northern cliff face, her mind calculating slopes, angles, and lines of sight. She saw what the SEALs, focused on survival, and the command staff, focused on the immediate threat, had missed. It wasn't a solution of brute force, but one of geometry and audacity. A major suggested scrambling a quick reaction force from a distant base, but the ETA was 3 hours. Valkyrie didn't have 3 hours. The frustration in the room was palpable. This was when Reyes spoke, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the anxious murmur. "Sir, the enemy is expecting a response from the air or a direct assault from the valley floor. They're not looking up." All eyes turned to her. Colonel Mitchell frowned. "What's your meaning, Sergeant?" "The northern cliff face, sir," she said, pointing to the screen. "It's a near vertical ascent. The SEAL snipers were right. From the valley floor, the enemy's position is unassailable. But from that ledge, about 2/3 of the way up, you'd have a direct line of sight into their rear. It's a blind spot." The Army major snorted softly. "A climbing expedition? Sergeant, that's a suicide mission for anyone who tries it, and it wouldn't help the men on the ground now." Reyes met his gaze, her expression unflinching. "Not if I can talk a fast mover onto the ridge first, sir. A low-level strafing run to keep their heads down. It would be a high-risk, precision engagement. But I would need to be on the ground to direct it." She paused, letting the sheer scale of her proposal sink in. "I can get to that ledge." Colonel Mitchell studied her, his eyes narrowing. He remembered her file. Top of her class at the Joint Firepower course. Expert in SEER. Call sign, Ghost. He looked back at the screen, at the desperate situation of one of his best teams. He looked at the young Air Force sergeant who believed she could see the invisible path. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only one he had. "All right, Reyes," he said, his voice low. "This is your show. Gear up. You're going in." The memory arrived not as a gentle wave, but as a sharp, clear image that steadied her nerves. For a moment, the sterile, pressurized air of the C-130 Hercules vanished. She was 10 years old again, the Texas sun warm on her shoulders, standing beside her grandfather in a quiet cemetery. The air smelled of cut grass and distant rain. His large, calloused hand, a map of a long life of labor, rested on her small shoulder as he pointed to a simple headstone. "That was your great-grandmother, Katie," he'd said, his voice a soft rumble. "She never fired a rifle. She was a cartographer during the war. But her maps, her knowledge of the land, they saved hundreds of men on those islands. Remember that. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon isn't something you shoot. It's something you know." The present snapped back into focus with a jolt as the giant aircraft hit a patch of turbulence. Technical Sergeant Caitlin "Ghost" Reyes tightened the straps of her parachute, the weight of her gear a familiar comfort. The colonel's words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, "This is your show." Asterisk, the plan was audacious, a thread of hope so thin it was almost invisible. Infiltrate alone, navigate hostile territory, and climb a cliff the enemy considered their own fortress wall, all while calling in air strikes on a knife's edge. Back in the JOC, after she had spoken up, the skepticism had been a physical force in the room. The Army major, a man named Briggs, had stared her down. "A climb like that under fire, with full combat gear? It's not just risky, Sergeant, it's a fantasy. We'd be sending you on a one-way trip for a chance, just a chance, at a distraction." Reyes had kept her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on Colonel Mitchell. "With all due respect, sir, it's not a distraction. It's a change of battlefield geometry. The SEALs are masters of direct action. I'm a combat controller. My specialty is changing the landscape." She had tapped the screen, tracing an invisible path. "The enemy is focused downward and outward. They've built their defense against the best special forces in the world. They aren't prepared for a single asset to come from the one direction they think is safe." It was her grandfather's lesson, applied with lethal precision. Knowledge of the terrain, understanding the enemy's mind. It was cartography for the modern age, but instead of drawing maps, she would reshape the battlefield with fire and steel. Colonel Mitchell had finally broken the tense silence. "Your file says your call sign is Ghost." "Why?" "It was from a SEER exercise, sir," she had replied. "The instructors said I moved through their patrols like I wasn't even there. They never saw me. A ghost. An unseen force." Mitchell had given a slow, decisive nod. The gamble was made. Now, hours later, she was in the air, racing against the dying clock of the SEAL team below. The jumpmaster gave the signal, the red light blinking above the gaping rear ramp. The howl of the wind filled the cavernous hold. She checked her equipment one last time. Her rifle, her heavily modified PRC, 163 radio, her laser designator. These were her tools. Knowledge was her weapon. The green light illuminated. Go, go, go. Reyes took a final breath, the image of her great-grandmother's headstone clear in her mind. This was her inheritance. Not a legacy of violence, but a legacy of saving men through intelligence and courage. She stepped off the ramp into the blinding darkness, the wind grabbing her instantly, pulling her down toward the unforgiving ground and the impossible task that awaited. She was alone, a ghost falling from the sky, carrying the only hope a team of legends had left. The world was a roaring, violent chaos of wind and blackness. For several heart-stopping seconds, Technical Sergeant Caitlin Reyes was just a speck tumbling through the sky, the ground below an invisible abyss. Then, with a sharp, reassuring jolt, her parachute deployed, silencing the roar into a tense whisper. She gripped the toggles, steering herself away from the planned drop zone, aiming for a darker patch of rock a kilometer from the trapped SEALs. A misdirection from the very start. Her boots hit the stony ground with a soft thud. In one fluid motion, she collapsed her chute, bundling it and burying it under a pile of loose rocks. The silence that enveloped her was profound and heavy. It was the silence of a hunting ground. She activated her night vision goggles, and the world bloomed into a spectrum of eerie green. Every shadow was deep, every rock a potential hiding place. She was alone, a world away from the hum of the JOC. She moved not like a soldier, but like a part of the landscape itself. Her training took over. Slow as smooth, smooth as fast. She placed each foot with deliberate care, avoiding loose scree that might betray her position. She paused every few meters, listening, her head turning slowly to scan the ridges above. The only sound was the whisper of a dry wind weaving through the canyon. Her heart was a steady drum in her ears, a rhythm she controlled with practiced focus. A sudden crunch of gravel to her east froze her in mid-step. She melted against a large boulder, her body pressed into the cold stone, becoming just another shadow. Her breathing slowed to almost nothing. Two figures emerged from a gloom, their outlines fuzzy in the NVGs, insurgents, carrying AK-47s, chatting in low, casual tones. They were complacent, confident in their numbers and their terrain advantage. They passed so close she could smell the stale tobacco on their clothes. She didn't blink, didn't move a muscle. She was a ghost. They walked on oblivious, their footsteps fading into the night. Once they were gone, she allowed herself a shallow breath. The encounter was a stark reminder of the hornet's nest she was walking into. She checked her wrist-mounted GPS. 500 meters to the SEAL position. The closer she got, the thicker the enemy presence would be. She pushed on, her movements even more cautious now. The rocky ground sloped downward, leading into the mouth of the valley, the Devil's Bowl. In the distance, she could hear the sporadic pop of rifle fire. It was the sound of Valkyrie, still holding on. She found a narrow crevice between two massive rocks, a perfect observation post. Peering through her rangefinder, she finally saw it. The eastern ridge was alive with muzzle flashes, little winks of light betraying the enemy positions dug into the caves. She scanned the northern cliff face. It was even more imposing up close, a sheer wall of rock disappearing into the darkness above. It looked impossible, but as her grandfather had taught her, maps could be deceiving. What looked like a solid line on paper could hide cracks, ledges, and paths. She just had to find them. Keying her radio, her voice was a whisper, barely audible. JOC, this is Ghost. I am on the ground. Oscar Mike. ETA to Valkyrie's position, 20 minutes. The mission was alive. The Ghost was in the machine. The last 50 meters were the most dangerous. The sporadic cracks of rifle fire were now loud and clear, the zip of incoming rounds winding off rocks nearby. Reyes moved in a low crouch, using every scrap of cover available. She could now make out the SEAL's position, a shallow depression behind a natural rock wall. A figure, face smeared with dirt and sweat, peered over the barrier, rifle ready. He hadn't seen her yet. She keyed her radio, her voice low but firm. Valkyrie Actual, this is Ghost. I am approaching your perimeter from the north. Do not, I repeat, do not engage. I am friendly. There was a beat of stunned silence on the net. Then the SEAL team leader's voice, Viking, crackled back, thick with disbelief. Say again, Ghost. What's your position? Look to your 11 o'clock. I'm the one not shooting at you. A head popped up from behind the rock wall. It was Viking. Even from a distance, Reyes could see the exhaustion and the shock in his eyes as he spotted her, a lone figure materializing from the shadows. He signaled quickly to his men. She moved the final distance in a swift, low sprint, sliding into the defensive position beside him. The SEALs, a group of 6 hardened operators, looked at her as if she had descended from another planet. She was smaller than all of them, her gear looking impossibly technical compared to their pure combat loadouts. Viking's eyes scanned the darkness behind her. Where's the rest of your team? Reyes was already shrugging off her pack, pulling out her tactical tablet and laser designator. I am the team, she said, her tone all business. She ignored their skeptical glances, her focus absolute. I need a sitrep. Exact enemy positions, especially any heavy weapons you've identified. Viking pointed toward the eastern ridge. DSHK, heavy machine gun in the main cave mouth, about 200 meters up. That's the primary threat. RPG teams moving between those smaller outcrops to the south. Their sniper is somewhere high on that ridge, but we haven't been able to pinpoint him. He's good. Reyes nodded, her fingers flying across the tablet screen. She was establishing a data link, her movements efficient and devoid of panic. JOC, this is Ghost. I have linked up with Valkyrie. They have one WIA, stable. I have eyes on the primary threat, a DSHK in a cave on the eastern ridge. I need Hammer 0 to 1 on station now. Her voice was calm, a stark contrast to the violent chaos surrounding them. The SEALs watched mesmerized as she began speaking to the distant F-15E pilot. Hammer 0 to 1, this is Ghost. Authentication, Bravo Zulu 9. I am your Joint Terminal Attack Controller on the ground. How copy? A crisp, professional voice replied in her earpiece. Solid copy, Ghost. Ready for your 9 line. One of the younger SEALs, a medic patching up the wounded man, muttered under his breath. She's calling in an air strike right on top of us? Viking shot him a sharp look, but his own expression was a mixture of doubt and a flicker of desperate hope. He was putting the lives of his entire team in the hands of this lone Air Force tech sergeant who talked to pilots like she was ordering a coffee. Reyes finished the transmission and looked at Viking, her eyes clear and certain in the green glow of her equipment. The first pass will be guns only. It's going to be close. Tell your men to keep their heads down. The trial had begun. The first sign was a low, distant rumble that grew into a deafening shriek, tearing the fabric of the night apart. The F-15E Strike Eagle, call sign Hammer 0 to 1, emerged from the darkness not as a visible shape, but as a terrifying sound moving at the speed of death. Technical Sergeant Reyes stood firm, her body braced against a rock, the laser designator held steady in her hands. A bright, invisible beam reached out from her position, painting a precise spot on the cave mouth housing the enemy heavy machine gun. In her earpiece, her voice was a metronome of calm amidst the storm. You are 1,000 meters out, Hammer. Come right 5 degrees. You are cleared hot. I say again, cleared hot. The SEALs pressed themselves into the dirt, a primal instinct taking over. The jet roared directly overhead, so low that the vibration shook the very rocks they hid behind. Then came the sound, a brutal, ripping noise as the aircraft's 20mm Gatling gun fired. Tracers etched fiery lines through the night, walking directly up the ridge and into the cave mouth. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The deafening hammer of the DSHK fell silent, replaced by the echo of the strafe run and the sound of collapsing rock. A cloud of dust and debris bloomed where the enemy position had been. For a glorious, fleeting moment, a cheer went up from the SEALs. The medic clapped Reyes on the shoulder, a grin splitting his grimy face. You did it, Air Force. You actually did it. Viking looked at Reyes with a new, profound respect. Hell of a shot, Ghost. But Reyes wasn't celebrating. Her eyes were still locked on the ridge, her body tense. The enemy commander was not a fool. He had anticipated the air support. The celebration died in their throats as a new, more chilling sound reached them. The distinct, hollow thump, thump, thump of mortar tubes firing from a hidden position further back. Incoming. Viking roared. The first round landed 30 meters to their left, showering them with rock and shrapnel. The second was closer, 20 meters right. The enemy was walking them in, bracketing their position. The world dissolved into a concussive nightmare of explosions and flying stone. The rescue helicopter, which had been cautiously approaching, was forced to pull away as a rocket-propelled grenade streaked across the valley. Through the dust and chaos, Reyes saw the third mortar round hit. It was a direct hit on the forward edge of their rock wall. The blast was deafening. One of the SEALs, the point man who had first spotted her, was thrown backward like a rag doll. He landed hard, not moving. The medic scrambled to him immediately, but the grim shake of his head told the whole story. Hope, which had flared so brightly moments before, was extinguished just as quickly. They were still trapped, and now they had a body to recover. Viking's face was a mask of fury and grief. He looked at Reyes, his eyes saying what his words didn't have to. The air power had failed. The enemy had adapted. They were back to square one, but with less time and one less man. The walls of the Devil's Bowl were closing in, and the sound of enemy fighters moving to flank them began to grow louder. The single air strike had been a spectacular success, but it had only hardened the enemy's resolve to finish them off. The acrid smell of cordite and dust filled the air, a bitter testament to their failed hope. The SEALs returned fire with grim determination, but their ammunition was dwindling. The enemy, emboldened by the successful mortar strike, was pressing forward, their shouts growing closer. Viking slammed a fresh magazine into his rifle, his face a stone mask of resignation. This was it. This was the last stand. It was then that Technical Sergeant Reyes spoke, her voice cutting through the din with an unnatural calm. She wasn't looking at the encroaching enemy. She was staring straight up at the monstrous northern cliff face, her eyes tracing an invisible path in the moonlight. "That's our way out," she said, her words barely audible over the gunfire. Viking followed her gaze, then looked back at her as if she'd lost her mind. "The cliff? Reyes, that's a vertical sheet of rock. It's a suicide climb. There's no cover. They'll pick you off before you get 10 feet. "It's not suicide," she replied, her focus unbreaking. "It's misdirection. They're expecting a rescue from the air or a breakout down the valley. They'll never look up." She began to shed her gear with swift, efficient movements. The heavy radio, the laser designator, her pack. She kept only her suppressed 17 Malawian Quachas rifle and a few extra magazines. She was stripping down to her lightest, most lethal form. The SEALs watched, their firing slowing for a moment. They saw the absolute certainty in her eyes. This wasn't a suggestion, it was a statement of fact. She was going. "The WIA and our fallen," Viking said, the weight of command heavy in his voice. He gestured to the wounded man and the body of their comrade. "We can't move them up that." Reyes finally turned to look at him, and in that look he understood everything. She wasn't planning for them to follow. She was creating a diversion so they could survive. She was going to attack the Hornets' nest from the one direction they wouldn't defend, drawing all the fire onto herself. It was a one-way ticket. "You don't have to," she said softly. "Just give me a 60-second window of covering fire. Aim for the ridge. Make them keep their heads down. That's all I need." Viking stared at her, a torrent of emotion warring within him, pride, disbelief, and a profound, humbling respect. He gave a sharp single nod. He keyed his radio. "Valkyrie, listen up. Ghost is moving. On my mark, we put everything we have on that eastern ridge. Suppressing fire. Make every round count." Reyes took a deep breath, her hand resting on the cold rock. She looked once more at the SEALs, these legendary warriors who were now depending on her. She offered no grand words, no dramatic farewell. There was only the mission. "Mark," Viking yelled. The world erupted as the SEALs unleashed a storm of fire towards the enemy positions. The crack of their rifles was deafening. Under the cover of this furious distraction, Caitlin Ghost, Reyes turned and began to climb. Her fingers found tiny cracks. Her boots sought invisible purchase. She moved not with the brute strength of a rock climber, but with the fluid, silent grace of a predator ascending to its hunting ground. She disappeared into the shadows of the cliff face, leaving the team below to fight for the time she needed to become their avenging angel. The rock face was cold and unforgiving, scraping the skin from her knuckles as she climbed. Each inch was a battle fought in silence, her muscles screaming in protest. The covering fire from the SEALs below was a distant, muffled thunder, a fragile umbrella of sound protecting her ascent. She dared not look down. Her entire world narrowed to the next handhold, the next tiny ledge for her boot. The air grew thinner, the wind pulling at her with icy fingers. She was a speck on a vast vertical desert, completely exposed. Then, her fingers found a deep horizontal crack. She pulled herself up, and her chest landed on a flat, narrow ledge. She had done it. She lay there for a second, gulping in air, her heart hammering against a stone. Pushing herself up onto her knees, she looked down. The perspective was dizzying. The SEAL's position was a small, desperate pocket of activity, but it was the eastern ridge that held her gaze. She had a perfect, unobstructed view directly into the enemy's back. They were dug in, yes, but they were also complacent. They were focused entirely on the valley floor, firing down at the trapped Americans. They felt safe, protected by the sheer cliff at their backs. They never thought to look over their shoulders. Reyes brought her rifle to her shoulder, the stock settling firmly against her cheek. She flicked the safety off. There was no rage in her, no hot-blooded fury. Instead, a cold, hyper-focused clarity settled over her. This was no longer about emotion. It was about geometry and ballistics. She was a technician executing a complex repair. The enemy formation was a faulty machine, and she was there to fix it. She placed the red dot of her scope on the back of a man shouting orders and aiming an RPG. She exhaled slowly, and between heartbeats, she squeezed the trigger. The rifle gave a soft phut. The man crumpled silently. No one noticed. She shifted her aim. A machine gunner, hunched over his weapon, firing long bursts. Another soft phut. He slumped forward, his weapon falling silent. It took 3 more shots before the enemy understood. The chaos was subtle at first, a man turning to see his comrade dead, a shout of confusion. Reyes worked with methodical precision. She targeted the leaders, the men with radios, the RPG gunners. With each suppressed shot, a node of their attack was severed. The disciplined assault began to unravel into panic. They were being attacked by an invisible enemy, struck down from an impossible direction. They spun around, firing wildly into the darkness, but their bullets hit empty rock. The SEALs below felt the pressure ease immediately. The relentless hail of fire slackened, replaced by the confused shouts of a leaderless force. Reyes moved along the ledge, a ghost harvesting the shadows. She was no longer just a combat controller. In that moment, on that high ledge, she was the most dangerous thing on the battlefield. An unexpected variable, a problem the enemy had no answer for. She had changed the geometry of the fight, just as she promised. The cliff that was their fortress had become their tomb, and she was the silent architect of its completion. The fight was not over, but the tide had turned with the whisper-quiet wrath of a single, determined soldier. The sudden, profound silence was more shocking than the noise of battle had been. The last echo of Reyes' final shot faded, leaving behind an eerie void. Down in the valley, the SEALs slowly, cautiously raised their heads. The eastern ridge was dark and still. No muzzle flashes, no shouted orders, no movement at all. The enemy force, which had been on the verge of overrunning the minutes before, had been utterly neutralized. The distinct, welcome thump of rotor blades broke the spell. This time, there was no RPG fire to challenge it. A pair of Black Hawk helicopters descended into the valley, their landing lights cutting bright swaths through the dust and gloom. They touched down without opposition. The quick reaction force poured out, securing the perimeter with professional efficiency. But the battle was already over. The SEALs moved with the weary, heavy motions of men who had stared into the abyss. They carefully, reverently, loaded their fallen comrade onto one helicopter. The wounded man was helped aboard, his face pale but relieved. Viking directed his team, his eyes constantly scanning the northern cliff face. He saw a small, dark figure beginning the careful, treacherous descent. It took her another 20 minutes to climb down. When Technical Sergeant Caitlin Reyes finally dropped the last few feet to the valley floor, her uniform was torn, her hands raw and bleeding. She was covered in grime and dust, her face etched with a bone-deep exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. She walked slowly toward the waiting helicopters, her rifle slung, her steps heavy. Viking stood by the ramp of the second Black Hawk, his own gear stowed. He watched her approach. The young QRF soldiers stared at her with a kind of awe, having seen the results of her solo mission. But Viking's expression was different. It was the look of one warrior who fully comprehends the sacrifice and skill of another. As Reyes reached the helicopter, she stopped before him. There were no words adequate for the moment. No good job could cover what had transpired. Viking did not salute. It was a combat zone, and saluting was a forbidden courtesy that could get someone killed. Instead, he simply extended his hand. Reyes reached out and took it. His grip was firm, conveying a world of respect. Then, with his other hand, he pressed something small and cool into her palm. She looked down. It was a single, spent brass cartridge from his own rifle, still warm from the firefight. It was not a medal awarded by a general. It was a token from one soldier to another, a silent acknowledgement that she had done the impossible. It was worth more than any formal decoration. Reyes closed her fingers around the brass cartridge, feeling its weight. She gave a small, tired nod. Viking nodded back. Then she turned and climbed into the helicopter. As the bird lifted off, rising above the Devil's Bowl, she looked out the window at the moonlit landscape below. The nightmare was receding. She leaned her head back against the vibrating fuselage, the spent cartridge held tightly in her fist. The mission was over. The ghost could finally rest,